I'm a huge Sixers fan. Like, I'm a huge, hardcore, irrational, process-trusting Sixers fan. I went when they were awful. I went to a game when it snowed in the depths of the process era, when there were 3,000 people in the stadium. The hype crew, the cheerleaders weren't even there. The front office came out to throw out the giveaway stuff. There were so few people there, and they were so bad, they gave everyone there a free ticket to a future game. That's how bad they were. But I love the Sixers. I do. And the fact that they're good now is amazing, and Embiid's back, and everything's looking good. I'm excited. A friend of mine took me to a game that actually ended up being the last Sixers game of the year in 2020. Like, we were in the stadium, sitting there, like, looking on our phones. And it's like, wait a minute, something happened in Utah. Wait, are they canceling the season? Like, it was crazy. And we had great seats for that game, and we had fantastic seats for that game, which was perfect for me because the previous game that I had gone to, I took my oldest son, and we sat in the second row from the back wall in the upper deck. We sat so far back, we knew to cheer by context clues. Like, we're like, are other people cheering? Okay, yeah, must have been a great play. Like, we couldn't see anything. We were so stinking far away. I could touch the back wall of the arena from where we sat. We were that far away. But this game, man, my friend took me to much better seats. The tickets that I could afford put us so far away, but his seats were fantastic. He had great season tickets. The tickets came with this all-access pass. We got to go into a special entrance to walk by all the peons going through the normal entrances. You know, just like, yeah, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry you have to wait over there. We got access to the Lexus Club, which had all this fantastic food. We were so close that the heat from the pyrotechnics during the pregame in introductions, like, I could feel that heat. It was awesome. He got me access to something that I could never have gotten access to on my own. I couldn't afford to sit there, but it was a whole new experience. And we're going to look at that idea of access as we dive into John chapter 2 this morning. It's one of my favorite stories. If you have a Bible and you want to turn there, John chapter 2, we're going to look at verse 13 to 22. But I want to set the table for us and give you a little background kind of on where we are in this and what this passage is talking about. So this takes place during Passover, which is one of the high holy days in the Jewish faith. It's an incredibly significant festival. In fact, it had been celebrated for thousands of years. Started back if you're familiar with the Old Testament, started back in the book of Exodus when God sent the plagues to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. God sent the plagues. The 10th plague was the angel of death, and the Israelites were told to sacrifice a lamb and paint the blood on the doorpost, and the angel of death would pass over their homes. That's where Passover came from, and they were instructed to celebrate this, to remember what God had done. And so this is an incredibly significant time. And at this point, the Jews have a nation. They're not this nomadic people anymore. And Herod, who was their ruler, had built this incredible temple, what's known as the Second Temple. He had built this beautiful, Herod could build. If you're a student of history, he was a genuinely terrible person, but the dude could build stuff. It was very impressive. And so the temple was this massive complex. We're going to show you a picture so you can get a sense of what this would have looked like. Huge, huge complex. There's this colonnade around the outside, around the edge, that sort of was where business took place. And then there's an inner court of the Gentiles. And then you go inside, and there's the court of women. And there's different levels of access all the way into the temple, which is the Holy of Holies. Inside the innermost part of the temple is the Holy of Holies. It's a huge complex. They built this what's called now the Temple Mount, this huge kind of platform. It was really impressive. It's a really impressive thing. So animals are used to make sacrifices at the temple, okay? And when people would gather for Passover, as they were supposed to, people traveled from all over to come to Jerusalem. This is a big moment for Jews. They would make this pilgrimage. That you would sacrifice an animal, and traveling with the animal you were going to sacrifice is not particularly easy because it's mountainous terrain. It's difficult, and particularly if you're traveling with kids, you don't want to travel with the animal you're going to sacrifice because 100% they're naming that animal. 100% they're naming it, and then you have to explain. They're like, "What happened to Steve?" You're like, Steve's in a better place now." So these were important things, like to have an access to people selling livestock, right? Because they would need to make a sacrifice, and people traveling from all over, it's a lot easier to buy the animal when you get to your location. And there were money changers at this time, right? Because people gathered from all over for the important holy days, and because they lived all over, they used all sorts of different money. Jewish males from the age 20 onward were required to pay a temple tax, which went to the upkeep of the temple. And the tax had to be paid in coins of the purest silver. So two Jewish men often joined together to pay their tax with one tetradrachma. We're going to show you a picture of what that coin looked like. Purest silver, this is what a tetradrachma looked like. So two families would come together and pay their temple tax with one coin. So the money changers were valuable. They exchanged people's regional currency for these coins while taking a fee for their troubles, right? So that's the situation that Jesus is stepping into. It's Passover. It's an incredibly important day. There's people selling livestock in the temple. There's money changers in the temple. And they're providing these valuable service for people, for these pilgrims that are coming for Passover. But there's a problem with what's going on. And the way we see Jesus interact with this problem really reveals two big truths about God and about God's heart towards people. First thing that we're going to look at is that God draws the outsider in. God draws the outsider in. If you want to follow along with me, we're going to read this. Verse 13 starts by saying, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Quick little textual note, because I love this kind of stuff. Jesus went up. It is not just kind of a placeholder thing. Because of where Jerusalem was, people lived lower than where the Temple Mount was, and Jerusalem was high in elevation. And so Jesus went up to the temple because literally the temple was the highest place in Jerusalem. So we see a little kind of geographical data there. It just helps us be able to trust it, like this guy knows what he's saying. Like this really happened because these are the little kind of detail that's true. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of those money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Why was Jesus so upset? Because Jesus is pretty angry. Why was Jesus so upset? Because at the most Jewish of times, in the most Jewish of places, Jesus is concerned for the outsider. Jesus is concerned for the outsider. What's important for us to know here, the issue wasn't with what was taking place, right? It wasn't a massive issue with people buying animals for sacrifice. It wasn't a massive issue that there were money changers. Those were valuable things that were needed by the pilgrims making this trip. The issue wasn't what they were doing. The issue was where they were doing it. Because they were doing it in the court of the Gentiles. They were doing it in the court of the Gentiles. This crowded court was hindering the worship and the experience of God by the Gentiles. But it's fascinating that the temple is sort of the center of the Jewish faith at this time. But even in that place, there is a spot for the outsider, for the Gentiles. There's a court of Gentiles where they can come in and experience what's going on. Because God's heart has been for the outsider from the beginning. The Jews are meant to be a light to the nations. We see all the way back in Genesis where Abraham was called that God will bless the nations. God's heart is for people. But the outsiders here don't have access. That all this stuff is taking place where their access is supposed to be. And Jesus steps into that. I did not enjoy middle school. I did not. I wouldn't go back and redo middle school for all the money in the world. If you're in middle school and it's hard right now, trust me, it gets better. And if you're in middle school right now and it's not hard, then you are far more well-adjusted than I was, and I respect you a great deal. I just wouldn't go back and do it. I did not enjoy that time. Now, my art teacher was also the drummer at my church, and during that season of my life, he just took an interest in my life. He invited me to be part of his family, invited me to go to a conference with him one time. He invited me to go to Lions games. He loved Mountain Dew and imprinted that on me. I just was struggling with loneliness. Like I didn't know where I belonged. Like I didn't know where I fit in. And he helped me find a place to the point where I call him every couple of years and just say thank you. He took an interest in my life and included me and helped me feel like less of an outsider. Outsiders, by definition, don't have access. By definition, outsiders are outside, right? They're not inside. But God is deeply concerned for outsiders. God loves outsiders. And through Jesus, God gives outsiders access. Hebrews 4 talks about it beautifully this way. It says, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. None of us belong in God's presence, but God invites us into him. We have direct access to him. The God of the universe cares about you individually. That's mind-blowing. We have access to him because God wants people to know him, to experience him personally. And Jesus is the skeleton key. Jesus opens every door. Jesus removes barriers between us and God. And we see that in this story because look what Jesus does. He makes a whip out of cords, right? He makes this livestock encouragement device, and he steps into this situation. And sometimes I think we're guilty, if you've read the Bible, I think we're guilty of reading the Bible as a sterile textbook. We read it like, we read it like, so he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the cords. It's just like, there's no emotion. It's just flat. It's just this data. But like, picture this scenario with me, right? Picture this scenario. Jesus makes a whip, starts driving the livestock out. Now, I don't spend a lot of time with livestock, but I can't imagine that cows are moving like in an orderly fashion. They're just like, sure, we'll move this way, no problem. I think there was a lot of like, moo. Like, I don't know if that's an angry moo, but a lot of angry moos. There's sheep making noise. Like there's animals unhappy. They're stampeding. They're probably like, you feel this energy moving this direction. And then it says Jesus came in and he scattered the coins. He flips it, overturned their tables. Like side note, one of my dreams is to flip a table. I don't have I don't have an opportunity to do it, and I don't want to ever do it like in anger. But there's part of me that just like imagine just how you just walk in somewhere, you're like, I've had it, that's enough, and you walk out. But I'd want to come back. I'd have to pick it back up because I'd feel bad. But Jesus walks in, he flips these tables over. Now imagine, I don't know, say like I had $1,000 in ones and I just threw it in the air in the middle of the floor. I'm sure you're all going to sit there calmly and say, well, that's not my money, so I shouldn't go take any of that. Not a chance, right? You're going to turn into a linebacker, knocking somebody out of the way. You're like, I got to get some of that money. So imagine all these money changers' tables are flipped over. Money's going everywhere. There's livestock running around, mooing and bleating and whatever else they're doing. It is absolute chaos. Jesus is willing to step into that, to cause that, so that he can point out the brokenness of a system that is keeping people far from God, who God desperately wants to be close to. Jesus removing these physical barriers in John 2 is a picture of how he removes all barriers, how he's the ultimate barrier breaker. Because in John 2, there were very real barriers that kept people who were far away from God from the temple. Very real barriers that directly impacted the access that the Gentile community had to the temple, and because of what the temple represented, access to God. And we find ourselves in similar situation. There are barriers between us and God. Some we've set up, some we've allowed others to set up, and some that have been set up because we live in a broken world. But Jesus breaks every barrier. Jesus crosses every border. Jesus transcends every boundary. So what are your barriers? What are your barriers? Is it isolation? Is it disconnection? Maybe it's distraction. Just kind of going through life, trying to avoid big questions and just filling our life with noise so we don't have to listen to our own hearts. Maybe there's different barriers for you. Maybe it's past hurts or pain or baggage. Maybe it's broken relationships. Can't see God for who he is because of an unhealthy relationship with a father or a mother or a boss or a spouse. Maybe it's injustice. Maybe it's self-worth. The barrier for you is I'm not good enough. God couldn't love me if people knew what I've done. Folks, no matter what your barriers are, God invites us to himself through Jesus. That God moves towards us because of who he is, not because of who we are. That God in his grace and mercy loves us because we are his. I want to paint a scenario for you. Imagine inviting someone into your home whom you've never met before, right? They're a total stranger. You don't know them at all. You don't know what they're like or even if they're trustworthy. But still, you invite them to come live in your home and treat your home as if it were their own. And it turns out they're a terrible house guest. I mean, a terrible house guest. They help themselves to your food. They watch your TV. They use your resources and spend your money. They break your stuff and they don't feel bad. They're loud and disruptive. They wake you up in the middle of the night because they aren't concerned with being quiet. They demand much of you and they give nothing back. They don't contribute to your household, at least not in the way that would justify their behavior. This house guest has done nothing to earn the kindness that you've shown to them. Are you following along with the person I'm describing? It's children. It's children. No, not you guys. I'm sure you're great. It's other people. It's other children, right? But think about that. I loved my kids before they were born, despite the fact that they had yet to do anything to deserve it, right? First year of their life, it's just eat, poop, cry, pee. Like there's just not a whole lot of other stuff. And yet it's still, you're like, if anyone, I'm not an angry, violent person. And then I had a kid and it's like, and if anyone ever tries to hurt you, like I'm going to turn into Liam Neeson, even though I have none of those skills. I will figure it out. Parents extend trust and relationship to children, right? We include them, draw them in, make a place for them. We want our kids to feel loved and valued and cared for, though they haven't earned anything yet. God does that very thing for us. That's God's heart towards us. Imagine the love that a parent has for a child, multiply that by an infinite number, and that gives us a small glimpse of God's heart towards us. God draws the outsider in because he loves us. That none of us deserve to be in his presence, and yet he wants us in anyway. Because of who he is. God draws the outsider in. But that's not all he does here. The second thing we see is that God calls the insider out. Verse 16 says, to those who sold doves, he said, get these out of here. Stop turning my father's house into a market. His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. The Jews then responded to him, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. Which is crazy. It took 46 years to build it. Like that doesn't even make sense to them. They replied, it's taken 46 years to build this temple and you're going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said, and then they believed the scripture and the words Jesus had spoken. And so we can read this a couple weeks after Easter and see that's the fulfillment of what Jesus was saying. It's a fulfillment. And what we see God doing here is that God calls the insider out because God is not at a place. God is with a people. God's not at a place. God's with a people. When we think about it, folks, the church isn't the new temple, right? The church isn't the new temple. Jesus is the new temple. Jesus is the new temple because he's pointing forward to what would happen on Easter. He would pointing forward to the crucifixion and the resurrection. He's pointing forward to the moment when he would fulfill the plan that God had to redeem people back to himself from before the world was founded. Our problem is that we've gotten spectacularly good at building barriers. Sometimes we care about the wrong things and it alienates people. Sometimes we care about the right things, but we do it in wrong ways, and that alienates people too. We can be far more concerned with having our viewpoint heard than in hearing someone else's. But folks, there is one truth that is worth building your life around. One truth, and that's Jesus Christ and him crucified. Everything else pales in comparison with that. I worked with students for a long time, and I noticed something interesting. Nobody sets out to build a clique to keep people out, right? Nobody sets out to do that. There's not a group of like ninth graders that are like, I know, let's get together and systematically alienate some of our peers so that their self-worth drops to precipitously dangerous levels. Like that conversation's not happening. So how does it end up? Like, how do we get there? I think we can be so glad that we've found our place in the world that we forget to be concerned with people who haven't yet. We forget who we used to be and how much we wanted to be included and drawn in. We are so glad we've found a sliver of belonging that instead of holding the door open for everyone who's still outside, we let it shut because we're just thrilled to be here. We see that kind of behavior with the religious leaders in this story. The insiders who should know this best were the ones erecting obstacles. They were making interaction with God and the experience of God more difficult for those who were furthest away. And if I'm honest, the older I get, like when I was younger, I grew up in the church. The Pharisees and religious leaders were like Disney villains, right? It's like they're twirling their mustache like, oh, we're tired of the train tracks. I don't know why every villain has a mustache that needs to be twirled, but they were caricatures, right? It's like, oh, these are just bad guys. But what I've come to understand the older I get is these are deeply devout, deeply pious, deeply religious men who have just lost the forest for the trees. They've lost sight of what matters. They're so desperately trying to do the right thing that they've lost sight of what truly matters. They valued convenience more than experience, right? That's why they were allowing this commerce to take place in the court of the Gentiles, because it's easier. It didn't always take place there. They're allowed because it was easy, it was simpler. Right action mattered more than right heart. Right religious piety mattered more than the mission. They were getting the what done while losing sight of the why they were doing it in the first place. The what mattered more than the why. And that's the definition of legalism, the what without the why. Practice or process mattered more than purpose. But folks, well-intentioned, well-meaning piety or devotion or religion without Jesus is ultimately empty. It's ultimately empty. The danger for us is we fall in love with the means and the mechanics of faith or the means and the mechanics of worship, and we lose sight of the object of faith, of the object of worship. We focus on the process of how to do this instead of focusing on the object of it. Look at the religious leaders and how they responded here. Jesus comes in and just upsets everything they have going on. And what do they say? Like, who are you? Who are you? And what I find fascinating is, why don't they have him arrested? Right then. It's well within their purview. It's within their authority. Why don't they have him arrested? Why don't they report him to the Roman government? Why not? I think because they sensed something different about Jesus. They don't know what, but there's something different. There's something different about him. Because what do? They ask for a sign, right? Something somewhere told them they couldn't just blow this guy off. Something somewhere told them there may be something to this, so they wanted a sign. They're like, give us a sign. And this is my paraphrase, but Jesus is like, I got a sign for you. Not the sign you want, but I got a sign for you. The crucifixion and the resurrection is going to be a sign for all of time to look forward to look back to this pivotal moment. Jesus is saying, I have a sign for you. We can be like the religious leaders. When I read this, it pricks my heart because we don't like when Jesus challenges the status quo. We know there's something about him we can't reject outright, so we want him to prove himself to us. We'll ask ridiculous and selfish things because we don't want him to be who he says he is, because we don't really want to change. We don't really want to change. We don't really want to let go of control. God, I'll believe you if you'll just show me a sign. God, if you'll just show up in the way that I want, in the moment that I want it, that's all you have to do. But folks, a God that would bend to our whims is not a God worth worshiping, because that's not a God who's fully in charge. You with me? A God that says, I'll do whatever party trick you want me to do is not a God worth surrendering to. And so as hard as it is for me to process through that, it's like, God, I want to surrender to a God who is sovereign, who is all-knowing, who is all-powerful, who's loving, who's merciful, who moves towards me. Because if there's one thing I know with absolute certainty about my life, it's that I am wrong a lot. What I think I want, what I think I need, what I think will fulfill me. Church, we are supposed to enter into the world and be barrier breakers, and yet often we are barrier builders. This religious community here built barriers that impacted the outsiders, and we do that as well. We unintentionally set up obstacles, making it harder for people to come and encounter Jesus. We add stuff to Jesus. We can say to people, if you're a Christian, you should believe this. You should hold this viewpoint. You should take this stance. You should belong to this group. We add specific ideologies and fringe theologies and political stances and personal preferences into the Christianity stew. And when we do that, we are building barriers. We're adding our own cost to following Jesus. There are some things that we're going to do as the church that might be barriers for people, right? Think about it. Seriously, think about it. Corporate singing. Do we see that a lot culturally? Unless you're at a Taylor Swift concert. This is like a weird karaoke night to people who are unfamiliar with church. But that's important for us because it's how we sing back to God things that are true about him. And worship is a chance for us to say what is true even if I don't feel like it's true in the moment. And that's a valuable thing. Think about communion. Think about someone who has no frame of reference to the church. Communion is like, so I get a little snack, but it's only for certain people. Okay? But those are things we're going to do because we believe they're important, because God has called us to do those things. Frankly, the idea of needing a savior is hard for people culturally. Why do I need a savior? So the challenge for the church, because there are things we're not going to compromise on, is how can we set up as few other barriers as possible for people? We may feel strongly about certain things, but we have to understand and acknowledge that everything is not of equal importance, because Jesus is the most important. Paul talked about that idea in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with Scriptures, that he appeared to many people." What Paul's saying is, I gave you the most important thing, Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's the thing we build our life around. That's the one truly transformational idea that exists in time. That we are known and loved by the God of the universe, and that God moved towards us to rescue us from ourselves. That God redeemed us out of our confusion and rebellion and brokenness and hurt. That God did everything. God came 100% of the way. That we might know we are known and loved. Isn't that something that we want to invite others to experience as well? A few years ago, I picked up a seasonal job because I love sneakers. I love sneakers. I don't know you guys, but we're friends. We're friends. If you don't think I saw you when you walked in, you're crazy. You're my people over here. This is my tribe. I do. I love sneakers a lot. And when I was doing the paperwork, I was told the discount was obscene. And it was. It was amazing. I got access to this employee portal that turned their entire online store into 40% off. I got 30% off in-store on top of sale. Like, I was just getting stuff. They basically paid me in shoes for 6 weeks. And I was 100% fine with that. It was awesome. It really was. When my status changed as an employee, my access changed, right? When I became, I couldn't walk in as a guy off the street like, I'll take 40% off of everything. It'd be like, security. But when I became an employee, I got access to something I didn't have otherwise. And what was cool is I could include my family in it as well. I could sign up my wife, I could sign up my brother, I could sign up my parents, I could sign up my in-laws, I could sign up my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law. I could sign everybody up. It was a Nike Christmas that year. I could have just enjoyed that discount myself. I mean, there's part of me as an older brother that would have loved to hold that over my younger brother's head and be like, paid full price, loser. I could have just enjoyed it myself. I could have just enjoyed that status as an insider, but I wanted others to experience the benefits as well, because God draws the insider out. God calls the insider out, that we don't stay inside. We go back out to bring as many with us as possible, because there's so many others that need the hope of Jesus. Why does God call insiders out? It's the crazy thing is, it's not just for the sake of the other, but it's for our sake as well. For followers of Jesus, we need to remember that we were once outsiders, that God moved towards us. The only special thing about us is that God uniquely created, knows us, and loves us. We certainly didn't do anything to earn that. Wouldn't we want others to experience that too? I lived in Israel for my sophomore year of college, and one time we took a trip down to the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea, I'm going to show you the shore of the Dead Sea is the lowest place on the face of the earth. It sits at the bottom of the Jordan Rift Valley. It's a massive body of water. It's just massive. And if you notice something interesting, if you can tell, if you go to the second map, if you look down at the bottom, there's no blue at the bottom. There's no blue. There's no outflow from the Dead Sea, right? There's no outflow. And here's why that matters. The Dead Sea is 34.2% salinity, 34.2. And if you think like, well, I don't know what that means, context is the ocean is 3.5%. You ever been at the Jersey Shore, gotten a face full of wave and like just felt like everything tasted like salt for the next hour? That's 3.5%. The Dead Sea is 34.2. It's nearly 10 times saltier. It's essentially a third solid. And the reason it's called the Dead Sea is it's dead. Nothing lives in it. Nothing lives in it. Now, all water has minerals in it, right? All water has minerals. The Jordan River, which flows into the Dead Sea, has minerals in it as well. But the difference is the Jordan River gives life, but the Dead Sea takes it. Because the Jordan River has minerals, but it's flowing, so the garbage doesn't gather, but the Dead Sea doesn't go anywhere. So all those minerals just gathered and collected until it killed everything. Why am I telling you this? Not just so that you'll do well on Jeopardy if this question is ever asked. It's because we need intake and outflow. We need intake and outflow. Intake without outflow will die. And outflow without intake has nothing filling it up. We need intake and outflow. We need to grow in our knowledge and if you'd call yourself a follower of Jesus, we need to grow in our knowledge and understanding of who God is, to grow in our relationship to Him, to understand what it means to be known and loved by Him. But we have to live that truth out, because all followers of Jesus are called to be missionaries. We're all called to engage with people outside and draw them in. We need both of those things, because the church is not a destination. The church is a rest stop along the journey. Come, get refreshed, filled up, and go back out. Folks, I think the greatest danger facing the church today isn't the antagonism of outsiders. It's the apathy of insiders. It's not the antagonism of outsiders, because we know the church triumphs. It's the apathy of insiders. We grow comfortable. Things grow familiar. Well, sure, I'll talk with someone if they show up here, instead of remembering what it was like to experience the richness of Jesus, to know the hope, and to want others to know it as well. Desmond Doss was a pacifist, but he felt an obligation in World War II to enlist. I mean, he felt he had to do his duty. It was very important to him. So he enlisted. But he faced a significant challenge, because the guys in his unit didn't have any time for a pacifist. I mean, he was mocked, he was humiliated. I mean, they would threaten him. They would say things like, when we get into combat, I'm going to make sure you don't come back alive, because they looked at this guy and said, you're not willing to fight. We don't need you. What's wrong with you? So he became a medic. But still, several attempts were made to remove him from his unit because they thought he was a coward. In 1944, Doss shipped out with his unit, member of the medical detachment of the 307th Infantry, and he ended up on Okinawa. By that point, his fellow unit mates began to respect him. They realized that he would put himself in harm's way. This one particular moment on May 2nd, 1945, his company climbed up this cliff, and the last 30 feet, 35 feet, they had to climb up a cargo net to get to the top of it, and they faced an entrenched Japanese enemy. They'd built bunkers, they had concrete fortifications, they were dug in deeply. Several days of heavy fighting, the unit was almost entirely wiped out. Doss continued to put himself in mortal danger, though, to rescue these guys, and it's incredible. On May 5th, though, the fighting had gotten so intense, they were ordered to retreat, and Doss refused. 75 men were left behind who were too weak or wounded to be moved, and Doss refused to leave them. 75 men essentially left to die. But Doss wouldn't leave. He successfully rescued 75 men, bringing them one at a time and lowering them down this cliff with this special knot that he knew to bring them to safety. In fact, he was wounded 2 weeks later, and he refused treatment until others were treated first. What's fascinating to me is he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by Harry Truman. That's him with his wife wearing his medal. What's fascinating is when he talked about it, he said he knew he couldn't do it by himself. He went back in to save one more. He said, I was praying the whole time. I just kept praying, Lord, please help me get one more. Please help me get one more. He had made it to safety, but he wasn't content to stay in safety. He'd made it to safety, but he knew there's people who aren't here yet, and I want them to be here. And that is the very same thing Jesus calls us to do. Frankly, that should be our prayer. Lord, help me to get one more. Help me to get one more. There's a great quote by an author named D.A. Carson, and this is like 80% of this is for Tom's sake, because Tom likes this guy. The church itself is not made up of natural friends, Carson says. What binds us together is not common education, common race, common income levels, common politics, common nationality, common accents, common jobs, or anything of the sort. Christians come together not because they form a natural collocation, which it's D.A. Carson, he had to use a fancy word, just means combination, but because they have been saved by Jesus Christ and owe him a common allegiance. In light of this common allegiance, in light of the fact that they have all been loved by Jesus himself, they commit themselves to doing what he says, and he commands them to love one another. In this light, they are a band of natural enemies who love one another for Jesus' sake. We are all outsiders who have been welcomed in. And what we see in John 2 is that the ultimate insider became an outsider so that those who are legitimately outsiders can become insiders. So I want to leave you with this as we close. Are you taking advantage of the access you have? If you call yourself a follower of Jesus, you have direct access to the God of the universe. Are you taking advantage of that? Are you engaging with God about the realities of your life? Are you talking with him about your hopes, your fears, your pain, your hurts? Because that's the place we start. And I want to ask you to consider thinking this week, to ask God to help you understand what barriers you might be intentionally or unintentionally creating for outsiders to experience Jesus. Ask God to help you see where you may be creating those barriers, and what can you do this week to start removing them? What barriers can you help remove for someone else? Because folks, we're in the position where we can say to others, ever felt alone? Ever felt like your life is a mess? Ever had a moment in your life where you couldn't figure out what to do next? I have. And some of that's been this week. I bet you have too. It is so important for us, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, to remember what that feels like so you can move towards others who are feeling it now. And if you're here and you're curious about faith, we're so glad you're here. We're so glad you're here. This is the kind of place to ask questions and to wrestle through those things. Because what we believe is that Jesus is the answer to the question every soul is asking.